Good afternoon and welcome back from the break. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. We're motivated by the great discussion and sharing of best practices, and I'm excited to introduce today's pre-recorded FEMA showcase with a focus on perseverance, progress, and power of partnerships, an appropriate reflection of the times we're living in today. For those of you that don't know, I'm David Marstead, Deputy Associate Administrator for Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration and Senior Executive of the National Flood Insurance Program. Thank you for including FEMA in this program. I want to join the chorus of presenters in commending the conference team and all of you for finding a way to make this format work. At FEMA, we look forward to this conference as we value the relationships with local floodplain managers and the opportunity to share, listen, and learn. A few differences between the ASFPM annual conference last year and this year. We gathered in person in Cleveland, and this year we connect virtually. Last year, I was clean shaven, and this year, sport a COVID-19 beard. Hopefully next year we'll be back together in Raleigh and I'll be beard free. At FEMA, we understand that many local governments are strained and face increasing pressure as we cope with the pandemic, social and racial disparities, and an active hurricane season. Before we get to our presentation topics, I want to quickly mention a few of FEMA's priorities, whether building codes, earthquake awareness, dam safety, floodplain management, BRIC, future of flood risk data, NFIP reauthorization, support of disaster response and recovery, reinsurance, risk rating 2.0, new insurance policy forms, pivot, or open FEMA, our data sharing. Each is individually important, but together power generational changes that transform mitigation and insurance that supports FEMA's mission to reduce disaster suffering. Now, onto the pre-recorded presentations led by Catherine Fox, Mike Grimm, Eric Letvin, and Angie Gladwell, who will join us at the end of the showcase for a live Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Fox, and I'm the Assistant Administrator for Mitigation within the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. It's great to be with you all today, albeit far from how we're used to attending ASFPM's annual conference. So appreciate the time that you're taking to be with us. We're very excited to share some important program updates with each of you. And before we dive in, Mike, I love that background. The camera does wonders for you.
Well, thanks, Catherine, but I really think it must be my new quarantine haircut by my personal in-home stylist, Allison, my wife. Who knew that Chad Bergenis and I would ever be Zoom fashion icons this year because of these technologies. Anyway, but for the audience, my name is Mike Grimm, and I'm the Assistant Administrator for Risk Management within the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. As Catherine said, we're really excited to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion ahead. Before I start, though, I'd be remiss not to pass the torch over to Eric and Angie. Catherine and I are privileged to work with them day to day, and even more so to call them confidants and friends.
Thank you, Mike. Hi there, everyone. My name is Eric Letvin. I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation. Now, I know it doesn't have to be said how challenging this year has been for us all, but I'm incredibly proud of the grit and perseverance our FEMA team has brought to the table in the face of so much uncertainty. In fact, it's that very perseverance that inspired the theme of our conversation with you all today. In our planning for today's event, it was the idea of progress driven by perseverance and the enduring power of partnerships, both old and new, that stood out to us against the backdrop of COVID-19. Every day as members of our communities and even just as individuals, we are proving out the power of human perseverance. Be it as parents, children, siblings, friends, we are finding ways to show up and move forward.
Absolutely, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angela Gladwell, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Risk Management Directorate here at FEMA. and carrying Catherine's thought forward, so much of what we do requires individual contribution towards a collective goal. There couldn't be a more fitting theme to underpin our discussion here today. While we'll cover a few different program updates, the idea that we all have a part to play in persevering and progressing towards real change will be present throughout. In fact, I hope you hear a call to action, because together as partners, we can amplify each other's impact.
Well, thank you both for highlighting the focus of today. I share your exact sentiments about our unifying themes for today's showcase. I'm really excited to dive into our presentations today, and I'm looking forward to the live Q&A portion that will take place immediately afterwards. Up first, Angie and I will take you through the latest updates on our work to implement the National Mitigation Investment Strategy. In fact, there's no better theme to accompany this subject than partnership and a collective call to action, and how together we can apply the National Mitigation Investment Strategy to our independent activities in pursuit of a shared goal. We know that effective mitigation investments saves lives and money. The strategy frames the initial steps needed to more effectively advance the practice of mitigation investment nationwide, and it proposes a single national strategy for the whole community to increase the nation's resilience to natural hazards and ultimately to build a culture of preparedness. Let me talk about the 3 goals for a second. Goal 1 requires us to demonstrate how mitigation investments reduce risk. If we can do this effectively, the whole community will build a shared understanding of mitigation investment and how we can protect people, neighborhoods, ecosystems, and critical lifelines. Goal 2 calls on us to coordinate those mitigation investments in pursuit of reducing risk. Shared information, reinforced strategies for risk reduction, and easier access to funding will help the whole community choose the most cost-effective and reasonable actions. Finally, goal 3 is focused on making mitigation investments standard practice in our day-to-day lives. This means the whole community will factor mitigation into all investment decisions. The strategy's intent is to improve the coordination and effectiveness of mitigation investments. The strategy will catalyze increased innovation and investments across the whole community. In fact, it was purposely written in plain language so that it can be utilized by the whole community. And the strategy focuses on implementing effective mitigation to reduce the burden on response and recovery efforts.
Thanks, Mike. In order to address the problems before us, we need everyone: citizens, communities, states and tribes, the private sector, the federal government, all doing everything they can to reduce disaster suffering. Specifically, floodplain managers can play a critical role in supporting implementation of this strategy. With your leadership and support, floodplain managers can help demonstrate just how crucial mitigation is for breaking the cycle of disaster suffering. In fact, we see states already creating revolving funds to support mitigation, raising funds through stormwater fees or sales tax initiatives, implementing statewide watershed planning, and addressing the needs of vulnerable populations and their mitigation plans, or implementing a flood standard for state properties to address sea level rise. And a lot of these actions are thanks to the efforts of floodplain managers. As we begin implementing the investment strategy in earnest this year, we look forward to continue working with you all to achieve this goal. Let's talk through each of these goals and some examples for a few minutes. The first goal is really centered around protecting what matters to communities. Local leadership can highlight mitigation strategies that align to community values and priorities and protect specific areas most relevant to communities, such as historic and cultural districts and landmarks. This recently occurred in the coastal city of Annapolis, Maryland, an area subject to flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, thunderstorms, and high wind events. Many of the historic buildings and monuments in Annapolis are important to our nation's history and are the lifeblood of the tourism industry in the area. However, in recent years, Annapolis has been subject to increased flooding and damage from storms. Due to sea level rise, the potential for significant flooding due to a hurricane or tropical storm is forecasted to increase with time, threatening historic downtown buildings. The Office of Historic Preservation received a grant from the National League of Cities Leadership and Community Resilience Program. With this grant, the city worked closely with the Community on Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan to address the goal of mitigating damage to cultural resources subject to flooding. The plan ties mitigation investment to community values and helps Annapolis residents and city leaders identify specific actions to adapt to rising water. Now let's talk about Goal 2. When it comes to coordinating mitigation investments, in FY 2020, the implementation team is assessing policy gaps or barriers that may impede the alignment of funding to meet community mitigation needs. Additionally, we're excited to be working with states to align on priority mitigation investment strategies. In the state of Utah, for example, FEMA Region 8 is working with the Utah State Emergency Management Agency as part of their Resilient Wasatch Front initiative to reduce the risk from unreinforced masonry structures, an issue that could be devastating to Utah in the event of a significant earthquake. Through a nationally supported pilot, we're supporting the development of a risk reduction strategy with public and private partners, examining available funding sources, and helping to link mitigation and outreach and educational needs to an earthquake national level exercise in Utah next year. And last, Goal 3. I'd like to, in talking about this goal, recognize the role of land use planning and building codes and standards in ensuring that every investment nationwide considers risks and appropriate mitigation needs. Whether a new subdivision or shopping center, a new road or hospital, or existing at-risk housing or businesses. FEMA has established a cross-agency working group on building codes, focused on identifying opportunities in our program implementation to advance opportunities to build stronger and build on existing partnerships, such as those with the Federal Alliance of Safe Homes. Once this foundational work is complete within FEMA, we can begin the development of a national strategy to advance building code adoption. We know that risks from natural hazards are growing, and in tandem, so are the effects of natural disasters on community lifelines, businesses, and infrastructure. Success depends on collective action, and there are many ways that our partners can support the investment strategy. This investment strategy is a vision that requires shared commitment to safeguard the whole community from natural hazards. Success requires maximum participation from the whole community and consistent collaboration between the federal government and its vital non-federal partners. The recommendations, once implemented, will reduce injuries and loss of life, damage to property, and negative effects on the economy and the environment. The recommendations will lead the whole community to a more resilient future. We hope that you will consider these recommendations and how each of you can align your current and future initiatives to these efforts. Please share the resources and incorporate them into the powerful work you are already doing. You're all already recognizing the power of mitigation, so keep pushing. The slow path of progress is paved with perseverance. On this slide, you will find where the investment strategy is located, how you can contact us, and links to our recorded webinar and podcast that gives a more detailed overview of the strategy. Thank you.
Floodplain management has a lot of exciting things going on. Last year, we analyzed actuarial data from as far back as we could get. What we found was that every year since 1978, we looked at how, on average, residential structures built to the minimum NFIP standards fared in flood events in comparison to those that weren't built to those minimum standards. The evidence is clear. Structures built to the NFIP minimums consistently and reliably incur less flood damage and a significant amount of less flood damage. In fact, when we look at those trends over time across all residential structures in the special flood hazard area, we estimate that the savings produced by the NFIP over the last 40 years has likely exceeded $100 billion. Floodplain management strategies work. The work that we all do helps to break the cycles of disaster, reduces suffering, ensures communities continue to thrive, and it reduces the strain on the Disaster Recovery Fund, on the National Flood Insurance Fund, and in turn on the individual taxpayer. What we do is important. We've had a lot of success since the NFIP was established, but there's still much to do. A few years ago at this conference, our leadership made a public commitment to hold communities more accountable for compliance, particularly in the post-disaster. At that time, we just completed a comprehensive review of the floodplain management program. And since then, we've undertaken a significant transformation, recognizing the value that floodplain management plays, looking hard at pre- and post-disaster compliance, completely revolutionizing the Community Assistance Program State Support Services element, the CAP-SASE program, and working to more deliberately drive mitigation investments towards repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, and substantially damaged structures. Many of the things we're doing to transform the program are to make good on our promise to hold communities accountable for compliance with the NFIP. $100 billion in losses avoided is just the start. Today, we're going to talk a bit more about some of the transformation activities, including the challenges we're seeing, what we've accomplished, what we're focused on next, and what all that means to you. Last year, we finalized our multi-year strategy. In developing this strategy, we openly confronted our program's strengths, which are many, our current and future challenges, which are also many, to define how we, as the nationwide floodplain management program, are going to continue to evolve over the next 5 years to best meet our mission in what can only be described as a dynamic and changing environment. Our strategy serves as a roadmap to the future, one I'm committed to, and one that is going to improve floodplain management, most importantly, where there's the greatest risk, the greatest opportunity, and the greatest interest. Hopefully some of you have heard this before, but it bears repeating. We have 3 goals that guide our decisions: focus our resources and help us make decisions, especially when times get tough and we are stretched across multiple missions. I'm sure you've all felt that and are maybe even feeling it right now. Those 3 goals are, first, to do what we do best, which is grow local capacity and capability to improve resilience through floodplain management. The second is to leverage our partner programs to maximize mitigation investments. And the third is to promote the benefits and drive demand for strong floodplain management development standards and for insurance. Okay, that's all fancy way of saying, what does that really mean, right? To say it plainly, we're going to improve compliance and enforcement, pre and post disaster. We're going to build the capability and capacity of our state programs and really leverage all the expertise that sits out there. We're going to drive the dollars to where they make sense, drive more dollars to the highest risk properties. And we're going to increase the adoption of higher standards and drive the demand for the purchase of more flood insurance. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to start by making smart decisions. To take on this level of transformation, we knew that we needed to start with better data and better insights. So a key enabler of our strategy is exploring the opportunities to use the data and analytics that we have available to us to both inform our decisions and resource investments, but perhaps just importantly, to tell the story of our impact. Our first step was to evolve our old Tier 1 approach and to develop the Community Engagement Prioritization Tool, or the CEP tool, CEP tool. The CEP tool brings together over 40 data points, or indicators, to help regional and state floodplain management staff analyze community characteristics, all towards the end of planning our annual engagements. The tool provides insights in which communities, which of those have the greatest risk, the opportunity to influence the built environment, or have shown a heightened interest in better managing their flood risk. These insights aid in selecting how many of these communities the program can engage with, either through our technical assistance, our training, our outreach, And of course, the keystone of our engagements are community compliance contacts or our community compliance visits, the CAVs and CACs. The first iteration of the SEP tool was completed in 2019, and it was released to all of you, the stakeholders, to use and test. Based on user feedback, we spent the last year developing our version 2.0, a more robust and interactive geospatial platform that has a fully refreshed data and additional indicators. Version 2.0 is scheduled to be released publicly on FEMA.gov in early July, something we're really excited about. Moving forward, we intend to continue to make additional data and analytic tools available to our partners and our customers to drive better risk-informed decisions and to communicate the impacts of our efforts. For example, we've implemented a set of program metrics that'll help us quantify the effectiveness of floodplain management. From the number of communities engaged by the program each year to the state, to the national state compliance with the NFIP, to the percentage of the nation that has adopted stronger floodplain management and building codes, to the flood losses we've avoided. That's a lot of data that can be brought to bear to share our story. We've also been working on building national floodplain management capability and capacity through the CAP SASE transformation. And this is a key example of how we're using data to enable our strategic goal through this effort. The state NFIP coordinating offices represent a full half of the national floodplain management workforce. And in 2017, when we did an evaluation of the CAP SASE program, the cooperative agreement that funds this function of us working together, it revealed that we really need to make some changes to increase the program's transparency, the accountability for performance, and most importantly, perhaps, is to provide incentives for state programs that have been knocking it out of the park for decades. We needed to find a way to encourage and incentivize that kind of behavior. Over the last 2+ years, many of you have been intimately involved in reviewing and providing input to developing what we call the tiered state framework. We created what we call the TSF to more effectively invest in and incentivize the state capability. By implementing the TSF and a new aligned program funding methodology, both of those things together, we aim to increase the accountability and visibility around the state activities. What is it that the state is doing in the floodplain management space? Enable a performance-based program allowing FEMA to fairly evaluate state NFIP coordinating offices' strengths and where they need areas of improvement and support. And then finally, establish a transparent, level playing field for CAP SASE to make judgments about the resources that states require to deliver on the goals of the program. So the TSF establishes 3 tiers of states: foundational, proficient, and advanced, to which the states are assigned based on an assessment of their performance against a series of benchmarks. And this happens every 3 years or more often if the state requests it. Significant strengths found in the state's TSF assessment enable special access to incentives such as additional funding, increased autonomy over work plans and strategies, and funding eligibility of certain non-traditional type projects. Conversely, gaps or deficiencies found in the state's TSF, coupled with their state-specific aspirations and goals, excuse me, provide a framework for determining the activities, performance metrics, training plans, reporting requirements, and subsequent funding levels that would be required to aid the state in addressing those gaps. So we just completed the first TSF assessment cycle in April. This was the flagship moment for the CAP transformation. And wow, did we learn a lot about the strength of state programs. And they are many. Some things we knew in our gut already, and some things were a little bit surprising. There's so much in the TSF assessment data that FEMA can use to ensure that we're prioritizing our resources and providing support for the states in the areas that's going to have the most impact. Some key things we validated about CAP with data during that 2020 assessment cycle. This is some really interesting stuff. As suspected, most state programs are functioning really well. In the middle proficient tier, in the current portfolio, we have 9 foundational states, 34 proficient states, and 9 advanced states. We also have a really clear picture of what characteristics are the strongest and weakness. What we found out was that states are strongest in investing in continuing education and professional development, delivering a variety of training, promoting flood risk and mapping products, and coordinating across the state to better integrate floodplain management and mitigation into state operations. We also found some areas where we have some room for improvement. And these included some things like authorities. We really need to work together and learn from each other when it comes to ensuring that we are equipped to enforce good flood risk management practices in our states. And that often starts with this enabling, this initial enabling legislation and the enforcement authorities that go along with that. We've learned quite a bit about this in the last couple of years. Another thing that we found that where we need an area for improvement is in substantial damage operations. And quite frankly, there's no surprise here. We have got to get better about ensuring that communities and individuals build back stronger after disasters. We also know that we're not doing as much as we can in driving mitigation investments to priority structures. Our existing rep loss, severe rep loss, and SD inventory needs more urgent focus. I'm going to talk more about these last 2 in a minute, and you're going to start to see some of these connections. But to reiterate, the TSF results are a powerful tool. They allow us to communicate our value to the nation, and particularly the value of our combined team, the FEMA and state floodplain management resources working together. They allow us to be more planful about our work and establish long-term goals, understanding where we need to improve and where we can offer advice and best practices to others, and where we have leaders in this space that people can learn from. To pinpoint where we need additional national standards, guidance, and tools, and so much more. We're really only beginning to understand how this data can be used to help grow our area. So what's next for the CAP transformation? Well, later this year, we're also going to be rolling out a new funding methodology that is aligned with the tiered state framework and the transformation goals. We'll also be administering an off-cycle TSF assessment for any state that requests it. And finally, we'll be standing up the Advanced State Partners Group this year. This group is going to be bringing together the 9 advanced states and providing an avenue through which FEMA and the other states can access their best practices, their advice, and their expertise. CAP transformation is one of the key ways that we're making good in the goals in our multi-year strategy by investing in state capability and capacity and strengthening the state partnerships and the feedback loop. We are better enabled to make transformative change to our compliance operations and the way that we address high-risk properties. Let's talk a little bit about working smarter post-disaster. This conversation leads me to what we're doing specifically around post-disaster compliance. It's no secret that significant, and I mean significant, improvements are needed at all levels of government and how we perform our roles to ensure sound floodplain management strategies are employed in the post-disaster environment so that we can break the cycle of disasters. In that space, we're focused on 3 key initiatives to help address the challenge: improving substantial damage compliance and holding ourselves accountable, implementing DRA Section 1206, and reimagining the basic element of our compliance program, how we do community assistance visits, or the CAV process. So let me talk first about substantial damage. In 2019, we created an internal SD playbook, substantial damage playbook, to outline the specific procedures and expectation for FEMA staff as they work with impacted states and communities to enforce and adopt the SD requirements. The SD playbook is intended to provide clear and consistent messaging of floodplain management expectations to better position the FEMA staff themselves to support communities primarily in level 1 flood events as a start. The playbook is the first part of a broader effort to provide folks in the field with more guidance on substantial damage processes and to support states and communities in fulfilling their responsibilities. So, of course, we're working at what's next, though. We're working on crafting supplemental materials for dealing with smaller disaster declarations and creating more detailed guidance and tailored training for local officials to address their specific SD requirements. We're also exploring ways to elevate local SD compliance administrative procedures identified as best practices and integrate those into a national approach. So how does our blue sky operations and our training and our preparation enable us to meet these post-disaster requirements? So big work in the SD space there. It's also a bit of a game changer in terms of DRA Section 1206. We're in the midst of implementation of this statute. So we're beginning to engage our internal and external stakeholders to increase understanding of the impacts and changes that are resulting from the policy implementation of DRA's Section 1206. For those of you who don't know, Section 1206 grants FEMA new authorities to provide assistance following a presidential disaster declaration. 1206 aims to, first of all, increase the overall speed of recovery by providing this assistance during the building inspection process and to enhance compliance with building codes and ordinances by offering state, local, tribal, rural governments those additional resources to carry out the things that are required post-disaster, these post-disaster activities. Floodplain management and building science is supporting FEMA's public assistance in the development of a policy that will implement Section 1206 reforms and provide more details about the specific types of work that are going to be eligible for assistance. We're currently adjudicating comments from the public and updating the draft policy accordingly. And we're actively preparing for the policy work that goes along with that in terms of developing guidance and job aids to ensure that FEMA, state, local staff are able to carry out their respective roles. This is going to include things like providing additional guidance in the 1206 context, so making sure that our SD guidance material actually speaks to the 1206 resources that are going to be available. Conducting state and local education and outreach on things like cost sharing and contracting, and then the respective federal, state, and local roles in this new 1206 context. We'll also talk about this in terms of how do we in the floodplain management and building codes communities participate in recovery scoping meetings to make sure that we've got a seat at the table. We're also looking at things like ensuring EMAC guidance for states is available, and also outreach and coordination with the state directors and EOCs to make sure they understand this new resource and how to link it together. Finally, in this last section of working smarter post-disaster, we're reimagining our overall CAV process. Community compliance contacts and visits are one of the most important things that we do as a program. Our ability to audit, provide assistance, and enforce compliance with the NFIP reduces disaster suffering and saves billions of dollars every year. Full stop. CAVs are an important part of a program where we spend significant resources, but we've got long-standing challenges that we are now starting to chip away at in a disciplined way. We know that in order to hold communities accountable for compliance, we need the process itself to be consistent, fair, methodical, and applied uniformly throughout the nation. CAVs allow us to reliably assess where every community stands so that we can address program deficiencies, violations, and other compliance issues in the most effective way with all of the tools in our tool belt, including probation and suspension. A team of regional and headquarters FEMA staff are currently participating in a series of sprints over the summer and into the fall to reimagine what this new process looks like. Their primary charge is twofold. One, to better define the start and end points of each phase of the CAV to not leave these open-ended. And two, to prioritize the must-do activities in each of these phases, such as the standardization of documentation that will support this notion of consistency, fairness, reliability across the nation, no matter who is providing or performing the CAV, be it across FEMA region to FEMA region, across state to state, and across FEMA and state. It is one standard and one audit. We're eager to engage you on your best practices and ideas for reimagining the CAVs. So if you will, stop by the virtual floodplain management booth for more information on this initiative and to provide us your feedback. With respect to leveraging partnerships to maximize mitigation investments, the next pillar of our strategy, high-risk structures that experience repetitive loss or are likely to be substantially damaged in the next flood event represent a complex mitigation challenge for all of us. This is an area where we need to heavily integrate, and you'll hear this from my colleagues in other FEMA programs too. We need to heavily integrate across the FEMA programs, but also across other federal agencies and to the states within your agencies as well, to make sure that mitigation investments are being effectively utilized for the most high-risk properties, substantially damaged, repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss properties, and for existing floodway development. At the local level, we know there can be unique barriers to mitigating RL, SRL, and SD structures. And on top of that, the resources and capability to address these structures lay at the end of an often complicated and lengthy journey that can sometimes involve multiple gatekeepers. One of the key objectives of our multi-year strategy is to increase community access to and understanding to the resources that can be leveraged for mitigation. We are focused on achieving this through a variety of strategies. In the near term, we're looking at the ways that we can partner with our HMA colleagues, the hazard mitigation assistance programs, the state NFIP coordinators, the state hazard mitigation officers, to map out an easier journey for getting more mitigation dollars to these highest risk properties. In the next year, we're going to be undertaking a few small pilots to develop a better understanding of if and how HMA grant resources are being used to mitigate RL, SRL, SD structures in communities that have experienced notable flood damage. This includes the methods and rationales that communities and states are using to determine their mitigation priorities and to determine if things like RL, SRL, SD structures are being appropriately identified early and addressed in those processes. Ultimately, these insights will inform the development of shared initiatives and tools across our programs to help communities understand their mitigation potential and the unmet resource needs, and then to best optimize those resources available to them to buy down their risk, and particularly these high-risk structures. So I told you there was a lot going on in floodplain management. To recap, I guess I have 6 key points, and I've got some asks to you all, my colleagues. So I said that we estimate that the savings produced by the NFIP over the last 40 years has likely exceeded 100 billion. 100 billion is only a start, and there's a lot more that we can do. These losses avoided are far from the losses that have actually occurred. In each of our spaces, we need to push these standards higher and better and pull those losses down even further. The second is to engage with us in our conversations around the floodplain management multi-year strategy. This document is our North Star. It serves as our roadmap for improving floodplain management. As I said, the greatest risk, opportunity, and interest. We encourage you to use that to understand where we're headed and to figure out the best ways that you can work or that we can work together to really drive these strategies. We're also exploring more ways to use data and analytic with things like the STEP tool and to inform our decisions around resource investments and to tell that story of our impact. You're going to have access to the STEP tool in a month. I encourage you to embrace it and use it and to be smart about how we're using our limited resources and use data to help drive those decisions. The fourth thing we touched on is we launched the tiered state framework this year, and that was a flagship moment for the CAP transformation. And we are all on our way to a more transparent and performance-based program that better invests in and incentivizes states. So be open to that. Look out for those best practices and tips from the Advanced State Partners Group. Engage in those conversations, and let's all learn from each other and find those best examples. Fifth, we're committed to working smarter and making a bigger impact in the post-disaster environment by reimagining and standardizing our ST process and our CAV process and preparing to implement this new policy that has enormous potential. There's going to be more guidance, tools, job aids, and information coming your way soon. But give us feedback and help us understand where we need to continue to improve that. Finally, we are integrating across our FEMA programs, and I hope our partner programs as well, to try to map out an easier way for local partners to navigate the process and drive more mitigation investments to the highest risk structures. Let's be open and candid about where our strengths are and where our challenges are so that we can all work together in that important mission space. As I've said before, floodplain management strategies work, but we have to be diligent about implementing them, even when it's hard, maybe especially when it's hard. We are willing and ready to meet the moment and address some of the challenges we've had for a very long time. And we believe that you all, as state and local partners, are willing and ready to do too. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Wilsey. I'm with the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division in FEMA at FEMA headquarters. Today I want to talk just a little bit about how HMA ties in with the concepts of floodplain management and risk reduction in general. But first I want to start with some of the basic fundamentals of hazard mitigation. On the left here you see that classic definition most of you have probably seen before. What is hazard mitigation? It is defined as any action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to people and property from natural disasters. I would alter that definition just a little and say it's designed to protect people and property from natural hazards in order to prevent them from becoming natural disasters. So how do we help with that overall effort in HMA? We have a number of grant programs. The first and the oldest being the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which was stood up in 1989. Then more recently, we have the Hazard Mitigation Post-Fire Grant Program, just a couple of years old. And we have our two non-disaster grant programs, Flood Mitigation Assistance and Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program. As most of you know, the PDM program will be sunsetting shortly, and we'll be standing up a new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. The BRIC program and PDM and FMA, there'll be more on those in a subsequent session following this one. A little bit more about HMA generally. To date, FEMA has provided more than $15 billion in mitigation funding to support states, locals, territories, and tribes in implementing a variety of hazard mitigation plans and project types. You know, of that 15 billion, about 20% of that alone has just been for acquisitions or buyouts, about 3.3 billion, where we've acquired about 48,000 properties over the last 30 years. Also, there are a number of other flood mitigation projects, flood control, elevations, mitigation reconstruction. They account for about another 24% of that overall $15 billion in mitigation funding. So flood mitigation projects, it's safe to say, have accounted for at least half of our HMA project funding over the years. So a little more of the particulars about how or why we do mitigation projects in particular areas, and especially for flood mitigation. So how do we figure out where are the properties that we're going to try and do mitigation? Well, as it says here on the left, we've got floodplain mapping studies done through the flood insurance studies, the firms that FEMA produces, state and locally produced studies. We do a lot of floodplain mapping and modeling, analyzing the risk of flooding. Also, though, we have a history of flooding. Where are the flood losses occurring? You know, where do the local agency responders have to go to time and time again after each flood event? Where do we get inquiries and complaints from property owners about flooding and problems on their properties? And finally, at FEMA, we maintain for NFIP insured properties the repetitive loss and a severe repetitive loss property list. So those kind of give us a good identification of where the risk is. We analyze that risk, and then we say, okay, we know where the risk is, but what are we going to do about it? How are we going to reduce that risk? So there are a variety of flood mitigation strategies and techniques that we use. Once these areas of flood risk are analyzed and identified, we look at different flood mitigation strategies. There's a few graphics here on the right that display some of them, but the particular flood mitigation strategy that's pursued is dependent on a number of factors. Generally, the severity of flooding in terms of flood depths and flood flow velocities, you know, the technical feasibility for a given measure in a given location, the cost effectiveness, community acceptance of certain measures. Are the flood mitigation measures and strategies consistent with your hazard mitigation plan, with your land use plan, and other public planning documents and priorities? Generally speaking, the top two here, graphics, acquisitions and barriers, levees and flood walls, those are typically utilized for the more severe flooding scenarios. But now we're going to look at acquisitions or buyouts in particular. And just to look at the buyout process. This is a team approach from the property owner to the local entity, to the state, to the federal, and on back down. The buyout process, as you know, is a kind of an iterative process, and it involves a number of steps and a number of players. On this tiered stair step you see in the graphic, we've got a property owner that may be experiencing flooding. They may contact their local government, say, what can I do about this? The local government may also have conducted floodplain studies or be looking at their FIS, or they have that history of flooding that they know of, and they want to try and tackle the problem. So they may put together a grant application for funding. They may be a well-heeled local government and do some of the flood mitigation on their own, or they may apply to a state program to the flood mitigation. But in order to get FEMA funding, they will likely put together an application, submit that application to the state, and the state will in turn take in applications from a number of jurisdictions and localities throughout that state, and they prioritize those. And the states and locals are putting forth mitigation projects that hopefully are consistent with their mitigation plans, with their land use plans, and so forth. The state will then forward applications to FEMA, the federal government, for review. FEMA will review those for technical feasibility, compliance with environmental and historic preservation regs, cost effectiveness, and so forth. After FEMA reviews those applications, a grant can be awarded, and then that money is filtered down to the grantee, the state government, step number 5 in the graphic here. And then that money is further filtered down to the local government or the local entities, the subrecipient or subgrantee. So this whole process, it can take a fair amount of time, but that's the nature of the grant-making process. Now a little bit more about the timelines in this grant-making process. There's been some criticism about the length of time it takes to acquire properties under the grant programs. I do want folks to bear in mind, though, this is not the typical real property transfer that you see in the private marketplace, where a realtor could hang a for sale sign today and have a contract purchase offer tomorrow for that property. The acquisitions and the buyout process through FEMA are for a public purpose. It requires a bit more scrutiny and compliance with a number of regulations and processes that have to be followed by states, locals, and federal entities. But we did look at the buyout process, kind of get a look at how long it takes at various stages. And we found that on average, it takes about 15 and a half months for states to submit an application, in this case for HMGP, following a disaster declaration. The average time it takes FEMA to review and approve an acquisition project is about 4 months. And we found that roughly 78% of acquisitions are approved within 2 years, and about 93% are approved within 3 years or less. So as I said earlier in the earlier slide, FEMA has acquired about 48,000 flood-prone structures since 1989. We have gotten inquiries from a number of press inquiries from various places about why doesn't FEMA do more acquisitions, or can FEMA do 1 million acquisitions in pretty short order? And we've done 48,000 in 30 years. I don't know if we're going to get to 1 million anytime soon. And it's important to note that this is just not FEMA doing these acquisitions. Obviously, it's the state, the grantee, the localities, it's the sub-grantee, it's the homeowners and property owners that have to agree to those acquisitions. So there are a lot of players involved in this process. Projects for acquisition, they frequently consist of multiple properties, and any single property owner can bow out at the last moment, and that could throw a wrench in the works in the implementation. As you know, HMGP, our largest grant program, it is a state-run program where the state sets the priorities and the timing. So there are a number of actions and processes that have to take place in order for an acquisition to occur. We have been looking at various ideas in the recent years about how can we improve the acquisition process, introduce some efficiencies, and so forth. So there's a number of things we're looking at. We look at some of the kind of creme de la creme players in this acquisition process. Harris County Flood Control District, for instance, where they pre-identify flood-prone structures and they work with the property owners in advance of a disaster declaration. They already know where the properties we're going to acquire. We've done floodplain studies. We've interacted with the homeowners and the property owners. We're a few steps down the road so that we can put an application together more quickly and get it processed a lot more quickly. This is kind of akin to the Sooner Safe program, if anyone is familiar with that, in Oklahoma, where they're kind of identifying property owners on a rolling basis who might be interested in getting a residential safe room for their home. They're just front loading and taking steps up front to make the application process move more quickly. We're also looking at perhaps establishing a rolling FMA funding pot to kind of pull some of the identified SRL and rep loss properties during the first 6 months of a disaster. There's also that recent FEMA policy clarification where we have determined that private demolition of property does not necessarily disqualify a property from a subsequent application for acquisition or mitigation reconstruction. Previously, the policy was if a property was demoed under public assistance, it may still qualify for an HMA grant, but otherwise the old rule that can't break ground, and if you do, you're disqualified from applying for an HMA grant. There's a little more flexibility in that regard now. Also under FMA, we've been talking about increasing state and local capacity, providing FEMA assistance, some technical assistance, and capacity building, and providing some outreach to communities with the highest concentration of rep loss and severe rep loss properties. We're also looking at increased cost share and things of that nature. We have a work group effort right now with the external stakeholders work group at FEMA headquarters and involving some state and local jurisdictions. And we are going to query some of those creme de la creme players, the Harris County Flood Control Districts, King County, Washington, others that are major players in our grant programs, and trying to call out some best practices and things that we could share with the nation as a whole in order to expedite the acquisition process, make it more efficient, and make it a little smoother going in the future. Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Brandon Suiza. I'm the Flood Mitigation Assistant Section Chief under FEMA Mitigation, and I was going to talk to you today about the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program for fiscal year 2019. We just announced selections on the program this year, and just overall, it was an awesome year for the FMA program. So for FY19, $160 million was made. It was appropriated initially, and that was made back in our August NOFO posting. We were able to announce $160 million available. But this year was very unique in that we were able to look at recovery funding. So recovery funding is those that funding that's from project underruns. You know, if we do acquisition projects, sometimes the properties fall out because it is a voluntary program. We had looked all through the history and all of the funding that we had available out on the streets, and we were able to find $50 million in recovery funding that we were able to roll back in to the FY19 FMA program. So on December 23rd, 2019, we amended the NOFO and adjusted it to add that $50 million in. And so that adjusted the overall total federal amount that was available from $160 million to $210 million. So we had definitely a much larger pot this year, and it's the largest that we've ever had in history. So we were wondering, you know, are we going to get enough applications, especially this late in the game in December, of announcing this additional funding? And we were definitely surprised. We had gotten much more funding that in projects of severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss projects that we had ever gotten in history. We also did have a lot of projects fall out because they didn't have any policies or didn't have enough policies to justify the federal cost share. Therefore, there wasn't enough of a federal benefit or enough of a benefit to the NFIF and properties that have insurance and are being mitigated. So one of the big improvements that we're making for next year is that we're going to be releasing a job aid that we just had approved, and it's going to be making its way onto the FEMA.gov site, but it's going to explain using open source software how to develop maps. And, you know, after we do get projects, because sometimes that the National Flood Insurance Policy data is limited and not everybody has access to it, we're able to overlay those over those geocoded maps that we get. So with that, that's the community flood mitigation cap that we did have available. Moving on, we had our traditional FMA project types that you have seen in the past. We had technical assistance for anyone that received $1 million or more during the last FMA go around in FY18. We had planning funding, so we had $100,000 applicant cap, and that allowed for up to $50,000 flood mitigation plans. And again, that's the flood portion only, and $25,000 for local flood mitigation plans. And then moving on to kind of our big priority that we have is the severe repetitive loss and the repetitive loss flood mitigation projects. And again, these are individual project mitigation activities. They are batched together, so we do get applications with like 25 different properties in them. But as we go down and we get these applications, we're prioritizing them based on the counts of severe repetitive loss properties, and then on the repetitive loss properties based on the definitions that we have. We go through the policy database and rack and stack them. And these are acquisition projects, elevation, relocation, reconstruction projects of severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss properties. So moving on to the next slide, our severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss properties report. So one thing that I wanted to point out is that, even though we've had this unprecedented funding available, typically over the past 4 years, we've had $160 million available. We were able to really bolster the amount of funding available for FMA this year by using that $50 million in recoveries funding and getting up to $210 million available. But as you can see from the from this table, the repetitive loss properties is a much larger problem than FMA grants alone is going to be able to tackle. The column on the very right shows you the total number of RL properties, repetitive loss properties that we have on the books per the NFIP definition. And so this year we have approximately 181,000 properties nationwide that meet this definition. And one thing to note with this, there's probably a 5 to 10% deviation. This was the most accurate and up-to-date information we were able to find, but it definitely is, you know, there's going to be a little bit of wiggle room in terms of how accurate these figures are. But in terms of the total SRL, severe repetitive loss properties that we have per the definition, is 28,000. This year we were able, you know, to mitigate quite a few properties, as I mentioned. But in order for us to really move the mark, the mitigation, you know, the NFIP policyholder flood mitigation needle over, we're going to need to do more collaboration and working with insurance to ensure that we can get these numbers down and make the NFIP more cost effective, essentially, and being able to run without running severe deficits. So with that, I do want to turn it over to Kim Rogers, who's going to be talking about the 2019 pre-disaster mitigation programs. And so with that, thank you very much. Take it away, Kim.
Thank you, Brandon. My name is Kim Rogers. Again, I just wanted to welcome everybody to this virtual environment. I am the pre-disaster mitigation program lead, and this year was the last year that we are going to have, or we have PDM. With the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, it established changes to PDM. And within the Federal Emergency Management Agency, within FEMA, we decided to establish a different type of program called the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. We had 97 applicants, which included 44 federally recognized tribes. And we received some from territories, and it was almost $540 million worth of applications that we received with a total of 665 sub-applications. So again, we were way oversubscribed to the program this year. What we were able to select was from 90 different applicants. We selected almost $244.6 million of projects and plans with management costs. There were 448 different sub-applications that we selected. From this 448, we had about $13.5 million directly from 39 federally recognized tribes. We understand that there's a lot more interest than what we ever have money for. There were almost $50 million worth of projects that were still eligible, but we were unable to select due to lack of funding. We understand that, you know, there's a lot of interest out there, and we're hoping that whatever is not selected here can ultimately get either resubmitted in a future either FMA or the BRIC programs, or if a disaster does happen, that communities would then turn these projects and plans around for the future. And speaking of looking ahead, as we close out this, the FY19 program, we understand that, you know, we are looking ahead to having in FY20, later this summer, having the NOFOs, the Notices of Funding Opportunity, for both the flood mitigation assistance programs and the Building Resilient Communities and Infrastructure program to come out probably later this summer, and looking to opening up the actual grant cycle for applications probably late September, early October. So we're looking forward to finishing out PDM and FMA for FY19. We thank everyone for participating in the grant cycle this past year. And we're looking forward to where we're going in the future and what the new BRIC program has to offer. And we're going to be turning this over to Camille Crane to talk about the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Camille Crane. I'm the section chief at headquarters for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community, or what we call BRIC, a grant program. It is FEMA's newest hazard mitigation assistance program that's going to launch this fall. And I'm going to give you just a couple minutes of overview of what the grant program is and why we're so excited about it. So we are a program that's coming out of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. We are replacing the pre-disaster mitigation grant program that's been around for 20 years. So it just finished its last cycle. And as I said, we're going to be launching our first cycle this fall. We've done a few things. We've been very intentional in our program design to listen to what our stakeholders have told us. We did a informal stakeholder feedback engagement series in 2019 that gave us 5,000 non-attributable comments and over 75 agency letters. And we have used those in the shaping of our program. The first thing we did is our leadership created our guiding principles that we have built our program around. Those guiding principles include supporting communities' capability and capacity building. We understand that having a resilient community is paramount. It's in the name of our program. So we want to help communities build capacity so they can become resilient. We want to enable and encourage innovation. And I don't want people to be scared of innovation. It's innovation from where you are. Any community can be innovative. And we want to encourage and enable that. We want to promote partnerships. We know no matter how much funding BRIC gets from year to year, and that will fluctuate, it's never going to be enough. So we want to enable communities to have partners both in their funding, in their design, in their outreach, but to really have partners within their community that help them. We want to encourage large infrastructure projects, so we're looking at the caps that we're doing. We want to maintain flexibility because, like I said, we're a program that is percentage-based. We're 6% of some sections of post-disaster funding for major disaster declarations. So we know that we're going to fluctuate a lot year to year on what that dollar amount is, depending on what the disasters are the year before. So we want to have a program that can flex with that dollar amount. We also want to be a program that learns over time, that continuously improves. So we want to have flexibility to grow. At the same time, we want to provide consistency. So where we can align to our sister programs, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, we want to be able to do that. Up at the top, you'll see about some of the things that make us different than PDM or new elements of BRIC. That is how we set clear priorities. So there'll be different priorities for BRIC than have been in the pre-disaster program. Those will be released with the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, that is scheduled to come out in August. We also want to build capability and capacity, as I've said, increase flexibility, as I've said, and streamlining our processes. We do have a new grant system, FEMA Go, that our program will be going into. And let's see if I can get to the next slide. So this is just a teaser. I had a session this morning for 20 minutes where I talked about a little bit more about BRIC, but we're really going to start launching our FEMA engagements next month in July. So every Wednesday throughout the month of July, we're going to do a session on BRIC, starting with just an overview where we do our full presentation. Then on July 8th, we're going to talk specifically about why it's called BRIC. It's not just a cute acronym, but we do actually I want to talk about what resilient infrastructure is, what resilient communities are, what partnership is. Then we're going to have 3 sessions where we talk about certain elements of BRIC that are important, being building codes, community lifelines, and nature-based solutions. So each week we're going to cover one of those. You're going to see more information coming out about how to register for those during this month. We also are going to record them so you can play them on demand if you can't make it every Wednesday for 1 hour to chat with us. We're going to then flip over in August when we release our NOFO, start doing NOFO webinars. We get really tactical about the details of the program. We do have our website there, which is fema.gov/BRIC. Please bookmark that. That's where we'll be putting all information as it becomes available about the BRIC program. And as far as timing, right now we finished our public comment period with the policy. So we closed that on May 11th, and we're working through our adjudication. And so our next thing coming out will be our NOFO in August, but we're spending the summer talking a lot about what BRIC is and getting our stakeholders ready for the BRIC program. So that's the pizza tracker at the bottom. So that's where we are right now with the rollout and timing, or sorry, rollout and training. And we'll be doing that throughout the opening of the application period, with the NOFO coming out in August and the application period opening in fall. Scheduling right now for the last part of September. So I look forward to everyone applying for the BRIC program, and I look forward for you guys in joining us on our future engagements. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Pudlow, and I am the Section Chief of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program section under the Disaster Branch. Thank you for spending a few minutes with me today to talk about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program for Health and Medical Lifelines. The purpose of the HMGP is to help communities implement hazard mitigation measures following a presidential major disaster declaration in the areas of where the state, tribe, or territory requested assistance by the governor or the tribal executive to enact mitigation measures that reduce the risk of loss of life and property from future disasters. Funding from the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program may be used broadly by states, local communities, tribes, and territories for healthcare, medical, public health, and other critical facilities. Over the last 10 years, FEMA has obligated nearly $100 million for 84 state, local, tribes, and territory projects to support health and medical care facilities with generators, seismic and wind retrofits, and utility infrastructure improvements. These projects helped reduce the risk and increase resilience against natural hazards overall in improving the health and medical lifelines. Many of these facilities are located in the special flood hazard area. So by implementing mitigation measures, it helps the hospitals and the medical community stay working during a natural disaster. So you ask, how can FEMA help? Well, FEMA can help through application assistance. To assist with the application process, FEMA has developed template applications for some of the most frequently implemented project types, including advanced assistance and generators. FEMA also released an enhanced version of the Benefit Cost Analysis Toolkit to be used when conducting the BCA for hazard mitigation projects. The new version offers multiple benefits that streamlining the user interface and improve the customer experience. FEMA will publish the application templates externally, and in the meantime, your state hazard mitigation officer can be contacted for additional information. What types of activities? Application assistance project scoping can be applied for and developed during the mitigation strategies and obtain the data to prioritize, select, and develop potential projects for future funding. For example, it may be used to identify the vulnerabilities of the healthcare, medical, public health, and critical facilities, in addition to potential mitigation measures to address such vulnerabilities. FEMA will accept applications from the state for advanced assistance. In the application, the state may reflect its intent to ask local communities to perform some of these eligible activities. FEMA also can provide technical assistance. FEMA staff can provide this by identifying mitigation opportunities, scoping potential projects, and performing benefit cost analysis. FEMA can also help identify projects that can be implemented quickly, such as emergency generators or non-structural retrofits. Limited contractual dollars may also be available under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program for state and local staff to assist them with developing the applications for projects. The 5% initiative is a feature of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that can be leveraged for innovative projects. This initiative allows grantees under the HMGP to use up to 5% of the HMGP funds for projects that are difficult to evaluate using FEMA-approved cost-effectiveness methodologies, but which otherwise meet hazard mitigation grant program eligibility requirements. This initiative can also be increased up to 10% for building codes that have been adopted and are being enforced. What are some other activities available under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program? A generator that is a standalone project can be considered under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program for funding if the generator protects a critical facility. A standalone generator project that cannot be determined to be cost-effective via the standard HMA benefit cost methodology may be eligible under the 5% initiative. Again, please talk to the state hazard mitigation officer in your state. A generator that is a component of a larger project can also be funded under the regular HMGP, in addition to portable generators and the cost to connect and disconnect them. Structural retrofits is another example of how HMGP can mitigate a health and medical lifeline. Modifications to the structural elements of a building to reduce or eliminate the risk of future damage and to protect its inhabitants. The structural elements of a building that are essential to prevent damage include foundations, load-bearing walls, beams, columns, building envelopes, structural floors and roofs, and the connections between these elements. Flood protection projects also include dry floodproofing, flood walls, other structural improvements to increase flood protection. It also includes protecting buildings' utility systems from flood damage. Another project type is public education outreach. FEMA may fund eligible information dissemination information. These activities include public education campaigns, brochures, events, workshops, videos to meet the specific needs of the population and the community's needs. These approaches can be integrated into almost any existing initiative. For more information about these types of activities and others, please talk to the state hazard mitigation officer in your state. Thank you for your time, and I hope you learned a little bit more about the HMGP program for health and medical lifelines. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much to ASFPM and to our panel of FEMA presenters. So please continue to submit those questions and we'll get through as many as we can with the rest of the time that we have available for you. We'd particularly love to hear what opportunities you're pursuing or what challenges that you're facing. So given our limited time, Mike Grimm and I are going to tag team on moderating the questions and we'll prioritize those based on today's topics. So Mike, do you want to handle the first question, please?
All right, thank you, Catherine. So yes, we had a number of comments. And first, I'd like to thank everybody for the home office design comments. Jennifer Tallender gets a 10 out of 10 on Rate My Room, and apparently some folks like my artwork, so we will be submitting for the Divine Design and the Dress My Nest TV shows on cable soon. So the first question that I wanted to toss out, and I think I'll do a two-parter on this, is first to Camille and then to Angie. And that was submitted, and it says, are you helping local floodplain managers integrate across many sources of funding and technical assistance, and not just FEMA's? And that's specifically around leveraging those dollars for projects such as habitat restoration, climate resilience, and stormwater. So Camille, to you first, please.
Thank you, Mike. First, let me say, as a former state hazard mitigation officer, I certainly understand the challenges when you, in a rural state at that, you certainly have the challenges of lots of need, lots of different programs, and how do you marry those together? Portfolio management becomes very important. There's a couple things that come to mind that we're doing at FEMA to help try to bridge those different entities together. And the first is in education and how we're supporting different webinars. For example, in BRIC, I've been doing presentations and we will continue doing presentations with some of our non-traditional partners. So for example, we did one with HUD last week, talking with CDBG grantees so they could have awareness on HMGP, FMA, and the BRIC program coming up. We'll be doing one next week with NOAA to educate on our FEMA programs to the NOAA audience. We did one in April with energy officials, educating them on the BRIC program. Throughout the month of, you heard me talk about when I talked about BRIC, July coming up, where we'll be doing webinar series every Wednesday talking about different elements of the BRIC program, and we're involving different federal agencies and different non-governmental agencies in those presentations. So you can see how they are, or what they have available in those different areas. In addition to that, that's kind of on a higher level realm. On the local level, what we want to do with the BRIC program as part of our building capacity and capability and what we can fund, one of those project types we're looking at funding is partnerships. So if a community is trying to figure out they have a need, but they want to see how they can bridge it across several different organizations or how best, how can some FEMA funding for that support that activity? At the same time, too, I would say also project scoping does that as well. In seed money and developing projects, part of that developing of a project is incorporating different elements or different organizations that might be involved or might be able to help support it financially or technically.
Great, thanks, Camille. Let's go to Angie, talk a little bit about another aspect of that. Thanks.
Sure. It's really a great question. And when we think about the intent of the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, coordinating those investments was really the reason that we developed the investment strategy in the first place. The problems that we were seeing is that we needed to be more effective together in the way that we're using the available funding sources, both public and private. And so as we were moving forward and implementing the investment strategy, we're looking at how can we address the barriers to coordinating those funds, both at the policy level. So looking at across federal programs, for example, what are some of the policy barriers to us being able to use those funds collectively together? And at the same time, how do we best support local governments in coordinating those funds? One of the things that we're doing is we're exploring a mitigation match concept. So it's really a concept of how can we help local leaders who have mitigation projects that they want to implement, how can we help them get matched with partners who may have funding, both philanthropy or other private sector partners or other governments to be able to help support those mitigation projects. So we're just in the exploration phase right now, but we're working with the Natural Hazards Center to help us get some brain power behind this on how that might be able to move forward in the future.
Great, thank you, Camille and Angie, appreciate that. So the next question, we had a couple of folks weigh in on the timeline for acquisitions, and appreciate, Brian, you giving a great overview of that. Kaya Lakia, I'd like to turn to you if you could talk a bit about the 12-month lock-in and how that plays into the acquisition timeline.
Yes, absolutely, Catherine. Thank you. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Kayat Lakia. I'm the Director for Hazard Mitigation Assistance at FEMA headquarters. The fact of the matter is you all do not need to wait for the 12-month lock-in. A few years ago, we realized that this was becoming one of those points where people were waiting for the lock-in before they could allocate the money and spend their mitigation dollars. And to avoid that, and to avoid the confusion between what used to be called a 6-month floor and a 12-month ceiling, we introduced a policy which essentially said that you have the ability to use any estimate within the first 12 months. And generally that translated to something as early as a 30-day estimate put out by the FEMA's OCFO as a basis on which you could spend and decide to spend your HMGP dollars. To prevent any kind of overruns from occurring, we also said you could go ahead and spend up to 75% of what the calculated lock-in would be at the 30-day estimate, so that we did not run into any situation where we would be overspending the money, especially as we know that after a disaster, sometimes the costs decrease as insurance payouts increase. This led to a few success stories, but the fact of the matter remains that there is still a huge challenge ahead of us. As we all know, for every Katrina, there is a Rita which is followed. For every Hurricane Florence, there is a Dorian which is followed. It behooves us all to spend the money quickly. We guaranteed, we put it in writing, and we said that if for whatever reason the total lock-in amount were to drop, we will not be taking money back. So it behooves and actually urge each and every one of you, the state hazard mitigation officers here on the meeting today, to spend that money quickly, because you do not face a situation where FEMA would be taking that money back. We do have a few success stories. Oregon, state of Ohio, who has done precisely that. They have ready, shovel-ready projects, which they've identified either under the PDM or FEMA grant programs, which once HMG money has become available, they have switched over and done those projects very quickly, as quickly as 45 days after a disaster declaration. So yes, the 12-month ceiling is something we are trying very hard to get away from and encourage people to submit projects quickly and early. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kayed. So we have just a couple of more minutes left. We also got a few questions on acquisitions. So Brian, first of all, can the land be used as submerged parks or other green spaces? And then another question about where FEMA buyouts have been and data that's available around that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what that question means about submerged parks, but essentially, after FEMA spends grant money to acquire properties, and that land is dedicated to open space in perpetuity. So if you're not putting insured structures back on that property or structures in general, it remains open space, that is fine. So it sounds like that in that question, submerged parks are just parks with a little bit of water on them perhaps, but that's fine, that's fine. In terms of where the acquisitions have occurred, we do maintain data in-house about where all the property acquisitions occur. We can share that with regions, and in turn they could share it with locals if need be.
Great, thank you, Brian. So very quickly, we also had a few questions about substantial damage from Rachel's presentation. So Rachel, do you want to give a plug for your session tomorrow, and then we will close it out?
Indeed. Yeah, there was a question about the availability of the SD playbook. I just wanted to say that the initial SD playbook is for the FEMA disaster workforce to make sure we're all aligned on the requirements. Quite frankly, an effort to make sure FEMA is meeting its obligations for enforcement. However, our next step is extending that guidance to local officials so that we're more clear about the expectations there. So we're going to be presenting on just that in session G4 tomorrow, and we'll talk more about that and all of the SD initiatives that we're working on.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rachel. So thanks everybody for all of your questions and your interest in our programs. As Shannon said at today's plenary, we all working together are the cavalry that can help reduce disaster suffering. So with that, I'd like to kick it back over to David Marstead for your final thoughts and our takeaways from today's session.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and I really appreciate all of the presentations. Great job, folks. As we work to increase the investment in mitigation and closing the insurance gap, we will always strive to perform with excellence to reach better outcomes, continually work to understand our customers' concerns, meeting their expectations, and adapt appropriately to meet the evolving needs of our stakeholders, policyholders, taxpayers, most importantly, in collaboration with our partners. Again, I look forward to joining you in person next year in Raleigh, where we will hopefully talk about how we successfully adapted to meet the challenges of 2020 and that together we reduced disaster suffering. Now more than ever, I'm convinced that as a nation, we can muster the collective determination to accomplish anything. Let's continue to work together to lead the way. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference and be safe.